Rather surprisingly, there was no vociferous viewer reaction to tonight's Cambridge Union debate on BBC Two, in which a Girton undergraduate, supported by the editor of the Daily Worker and an economist from the other side of the Iron Curtain, proposed the motion that this House could live happily under communism. The verdict of the House was comfortably that it couldn't. But had they left out the word happily, so that the motion now read that this House could live under communism, or any other kind of totalitarian government, the result might have been very much more inflammatory, if one's to go by the response given to a programme that went out on BBC one Sunday night 11 years ago.
This is one man's alarmed vision of the future.
Well, that was the opening sequence of the BBC's play of 1984 by George Orwell, produced in 1954. It showed Britain under a totalitarian government and British people operating the machinery of a police state to keep their fellow Britons down. It starred Peter Cushing as Winston Smith, a government worker who disobeyed the rules and fell in love with Julia, a fellow government worker, played by Yvonne Mitchell. André Morell played O'Brien, the state official who took their case in hand, interrogated and tortured Winston, and finally broke his spirit. It's interesting that though George Orwell's novel had been on the bookstalls for 6 years when BBC took it and turned it into a play, yet it was television that made it notorious. It released a flood of bitter reproaches from outraged viewers, and the press made front-page news of this with their customary zeal.
Tortures on TV start biggest protest story. A television play last night shocked the nation. It brought the biggest flood of protests the BBC...
Storm on TV horror. Hundreds of angry viewers telephoned the BBC.
MPs say TV panders to sadism. 5 Conservative MPs have tabled a motion in Parliament.
Reeks of decadence and corruption. So said Jonah Barrington in yesterday's Daily Sketch.
Blood on his face. Viewers say one of the play's stars, Peter Cushing, crippled in untold...
Rats from sewers. Twice rats were shown running around in cages.
Repeat, sadists.
Well, over the last few weeks, Michael Dean has been speaking to a number of the principal people involved in 1984. And first, the man at whom very much of the public barracking was aimed, the director, Rudolph Cartier.
Were you prepared for the violent audience response you got when 1984 was first produced?
Not actually. We were a bit surprised ourselves. When the play was scheduled, we knew we would have some sort of reaction, but as it was the usual Sunday play, and at that time the audience were used to strong stuff, to a big, strong play on a Sunday, we expected some sort of reaction, but what happened the next day was beyond our expectations. In every pub, in underground buses, in clubs, there was only one topic, 1984, and the rats, and the violence in it. And all the papers had headlines that one should ban this play and one should sue the BBC. It's a situation similar to the situation now.
When you actually put the play out, of course, in 1954, BBC was the program monopoly. Now,
yes.
You must have been conscious of the fact this was a Sunday night you were putting
Yes.
it out, and that you had this vast and therefore undiscriminating and vulnerable audience.
And captive audience. They couldn't get away from it. They couldn't switch over to another channel.
Considering all these facts, as you look back now, wasn't this too strong a meat?
No, because the book was known. It all depended on us how we present the book. And then we had, of course, Nigel Kneale's first-class script. And when on reading the script, we saw we could make it highly dramatic, but true to life and to present-day life forecast of the future. Don't forget, we had just finished the Quatermass Experiment. So that means the audience were attuned to some sort of strong stuff from Nigel Kneale and from myself.
Well, I was working on the BBC staff in those days, and it was just a routine job. It had been lying around as a proposition for some time, and I think it was felt they could tackle it as a technical job. Television had just sort of expanded to being able to take on an epic, and this was viewed as one.
Had you read the book? Were you familiar with most of Orwell's
Oh,
work?
yeah, no, not all of Orwell, but I knew this book very well. And I was very keen to do it. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a dare. It was biting off quite a lot at that time. A short play clearly wouldn't get it across because there were so many concepts that had to be developed, like newspeak, like the artificial language of 1984, doublethink, which is the process of reversing your own thoughts at will. And these things have to be not only described in words, but shown in action. And this is the sort of thing that was absolutely vital. I knew it would take time to do this, and it took 2 hours, and it still takes 2 hours.
We had to shoot certain film sequences to interrupt the live transmission for the sole purpose of reorganizing the studio, resetting the scenery, and getting ready for the continuation of it. We had a 5 minutes interval during which we put out the picture of Big Brother glaring at the audience for 5 minutes. Big Brother watches you, and then we continued. But it wasn't the length of the play, it was the complexity of the play. For example, there is a scene in the end when Winston, the hero, after all his torture, and looked into the mirror and suddenly sees he has become an old and ugly man. Now, this shot of the mirror, we had to pre-film 3 weeks before the whole thing started to get it ready. So the actor who played Winston, Peter Cushing, had to work himself up to that particular mood, which he usually reaches the end of the play 3 weeks before rehearsal started.
Look. If you are human, that is humanity.
Those scenes had to be shot even before the rehearsals for the whole play took place. So most of the people in the piece, Miss Yvonne Mitchell and André Morell and Donald Pleasance and all, wonderful cast, they were all pretty experienced film actors, and I think that helped them a lot, because as you know, in films you're called upon to do the most extraordinary things, 8 o'clock in the morning, and all out of context with the film that you're making. So that helped us all. We'd had long chats with Rudolph Cartier before as to what we would do, but one had to remember that we had yet 3 weeks rehearsals to go, and then the scenes we were shooting would be inserted, so you had to sort of work up to that and then imagine after what you were going to do.
You see, we did the whole thing live, but we filmed 2 little bits.
Yes.
And one was an outdoor bit, and the other was which was not used in those days, but it was a piece of Alexandra Palace. For some reason we went there, although it was after Alexandra Palace's time. And there was in fact a canteen there, and we were dressed in our boiler suits for this scene where the prole behind the counter says, them's with salt, them's without, them's with salt, them's without, or something to that effect, and you've got your lunch and you've got one with salt or you've got one without.
Now, come on, please. Them stew with salt, them stew without.
And then we actually, keeping our boiler suits on because we hadn't finished the scene, we actually went to the canteen at Alexandra Palace for our particular lunch. And there was a woman saying, them's with sugar, them's without, them. We thought, what? We're in it already. We really are there. Yes. And then began the fright that not only could it happen, but there was the beginning of it.
Well, you wanted to know where the locations were?
Yes.
Well, strangely enough, we're sitting on one of them now. It was the old buildings that were torn down to make way for the new BBC television centre. Terrible old buildings, and they had been biffed around with these great balls on chains, and it looked exactly like the period we were after. I think it's fascinating to think that 1984 was shot on the old site of the BBC new building.
And it was very desolate in those
Very,
days.
oh yes, and there were extraordinary foundations here because they looked like almost like tanks, water tanks, but only about 3 foot deep. and all this rubble, but it looks exactly as though a bomb had hit it, which I believe it was part and parcel of bomb damage, plus what the BBC had started to do, or the engineers had started to do preparatory to building this new magnificent building. But it's extraordinary that sort of literally out of the ashes should have come 1984 fall of BBC.
For one thing, you could see the effect it had on the actors, who, as they got deeper and deeper into it, began to practically drift out of 1954 into 1984, and they got very depressed.
By the play?
By the play, by being these people. And they had, I suppose, more than merely being in a contemporary play, they were having to project themselves completely into this thing to create a spirit of this sort of horrible time, and it did prey on them.
I can't remember now just where we did rehearse, but it was one of those appalling boys' clubs or church halls that Rudolph Cartier, the director, always seemed to find the worst, because they were the furthest away, so that he would get less interference from the BBC. And it was a terribly depressing place. But it wasn't just that. It was extraordinary during rehearsals. The sort of atmosphere of this novel really depressed us enormously. You know, working it out and trying to act the parts.
We used to rehearse in dreadful village halls and terrible sort of places where there was bunting up, and you knew the Boy Scouts would come in the evening. It was cold and dreadful and dreary, which was marvellous for a start. And the one I remember particularly was off the Marylebone Road. There was a dreadful hall there, and cold and right for starting this terrifying play. And you know, Orwell calls the very poor, the sort of worthless, as he dubs them, people, the proles, the sort of proletariat. And on one side of us in Marylebone was, still don't know if it still exists. I can only describe them as workhouses where old men shuffled. They were always allowed out, but you felt that they were allowed out and they were going to be put back into the workhouse in a minute, and they used to shuffle along the pavements and really gave one the feeling of what the prole sector was meant to be like. And walking along the curbs and threadbare. And then where we used to go and have lunch on the other side, down Marylebone High Street, I think it's called, was rather grand, and ladies in fur coats. And it was so near. You know, our hall was just between the two. And I remember going into a perfectly ordinary restaurant and seeing a menu. Am I talking too much?
No.
Seeing a menu which had a choice on it, and realizing that, of course, one had a choice, which one certainly doesn't in Orwell's 1984. There is no choice. That is your food. And there was a choice of perhaps fish and chips or sausages and chips. And the feeling that in whatever date that was, now one has choice in anything so small as what one's going to have for lunch. And also coming back, passing the sweet shop and buying a bar of chocolate, because one could still buy a bar of chocolate. And one moment one got into that hall, one knew that buying chocolate was forbidden, that there was no such thing as chocolate, and that choice was forbidden. And I think it must have had a terrific impact on us, because we were so excited at going out for lunch. You see what I mean? Of jumping away from 1984 back into the date in which one still has choice.
One knew it was disturbing because it was the truth, you see, and I think that's what scared people. I mean, almost 80% or even more percent of what took place in 1984 had actually taken place in the world, because Orwell was a bit of a prophet, and it only needed that extra 10% to make the whole thing true. And I think that's what scared people when they got all this tremendous press and arguments and telephone calls going on that it should never have been done. And it was the truth, because you can do all sorts of things. If you like to mention, say, anything like Frankenstein, that is impossible. That could never happen. So therefore, you can go and be scared, but you know it can't happen. But 1984 can and could still happen. I think that's what scared people, and one felt that in the script and indeed in the playing, indeed.
Well, not that most of those who complained would admit that it frightened them. Here, from over 2,000 letters and telegrams, is a typical response.
Last night's play insulting to people's intelligence. Shocking bad taste on Sunday night.
And here's the same thing said at greater length.
No, we are not ostriches with our heads buried in the sand. We've all come to the conclusion that the persons responsible for putting on the play are sadists and readers of horror comics, and we, the public, will work to get television censored as the films have to be. For weeks on Sundays we have to watch dismal, immoral and sadistically highbrow plays. Thank God for Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family.
Another writer, a schoolmaster who might be thought less likely to thank God for the Grove family, was no more grateful for 1984.
I do not think anyone could argue that the play was obscene to a degree and quite unsuitable for the vast audience to which it was playing. Some of the topics discussed were quite revolting to any decent person and certainly struck at the root of everything a respectable school tries to teach. It's quite true that one could turn the instrument off, which in fact I did. But this only accentuates the harm done in the eyes of an adolescent audience, and I think one is entitled to believe that the BBC will not televise such a play.
But they already had, and furthermore they repeated it. More letters, more telegrams.
Strongly protest against repetition of play 1984.
And more bluntly,
stop repeat of Sunday's horror.
The play's defenders replied in kind.
Please repeat 1984. No doubt some have forgotten Belson.
And we'll give the last word to a group of professionals who were sharp enough to see that an attack on Orwell could be interpreted as an attack on them.
As professional writers, we have the deepest respect for the technical achievements, and as members of the public, we have the greatest admiration for the courage required to say something, however grim and unpleasant, which still needed to be said. We can only assume that the people whose complaints received so much publicity would make ideal members of a 1984 society, since obviously they are chained to TV sets without the strength of mind to turn off a program they don't like or the ability to appreciate anything more.
I was completely astounded at the vehemence of the outcry against it. I think really probably what upset people so much was the thought that it did take place in England. I think if the locale had been somewhere else, then they wouldn't have been quite so upset. But it was, I think, the public reaction, the anti-reaction, was caused quite largely by the fact that the locale was England and that this could happen in this country. People didn't want to believe that at all, and I think it upset them to think that it could happen.
It was rather exciting that people had taken so much notice. And then after that, which was more exciting still, suddenly, the critics on every newspaper had said, this is dreadful, this is awful, this shouldn't be allowed. And then the next day the editors were writing editorials saying, quite against their critics, this is the most marvellous thing, the BBC grows up. And all this was going on, you know.
It was hectic for about a week. You know, one was being... we went in the telephone book, which saved us a certain amount of trouble. But one was very conscious of the fuss, which was ridiculous, in fact, in the first place, simply by people who hadn't seen that we were, in fact, operating a satire, and they took it literally and thought we were trying to horrify them and be sadistic instead of commenting on sadism.
There had been a tremendous outcry, and there'd even been a leader in the Times, and but I was getting quite accustomed to it because even in those the few days interval between the two, already lorry drivers were leaning out of their cabs and yelling at me, "How's your big brother?" and things like that. Indeed, some people quite erroneously hailed me as Big Brother, but we were rather eager to do it again. In fact, I think that all the casts, that everybody concerned with it would have felt really rather deprived if we hadn't done it again. We were really very eager to do it again.
Doing any play a second time under those conditions is terrifying because, you see, you did it live on Sunday, then Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday you had all the reports of friends, enemies, newspapers, what everyone had to say about it. If they said it's marvellous, then you had to live up to being marvellous. If they said it was dreadful, you thought, oh dear, we've got to go and bore people again for another 2 hours on Thursday.
You had to repeat the performance again live.
Yes, on the Thursday.
In the suddenly tensely charged atmosphere of all this.
Yes, and then we knew everybody would be looking, and then it was frightening, not because everybody would be watching us, but because the floor manager and someone else, I've forgotten who, had threatening letters that if we did it again, they would blow us up. And we had CID men all over the place, and we were terrified, and we kept on looking at stagehands thinking, didn't see him last time, he wasn't here on Sunday, do you think he's got a bomb? And all this was going, it was absolutely terrifying, until the thing began, and then one forgot.
if it had been a failure and not one paper had stirred or given it one good word, we would have been depressed, and the depression would show itself on the screen. But so we were elated by all the reaction, pro and con, by questions in Parliament and people ringing up and protesting. And the BBC was absolutely marvelous about it. They ignored all the protests. They were absolutely boot-faced. And we had ordered to go out exactly as we were on Sunday, live and without any cuts.
I firmly believe that the public shouldn't be fed entirely on chocolate, and I see no reason why, as in those days, it was accepted that there was a play on Sunday nights. There always was a play on Sunday night, and it was, as you say, repeated on Thursdays. And they had plays of every kind, every sort of play that you could imagine. If every Sunday night there had been a play with such horrible implications as 1984, then I think, yes, there would have been grounds for strong complaint, but not at all. This was one in how many? In 100?
Indeed.
I see nothing against producing that sort of thing. In fact, I think one of the things that I admire the BBC for, and I have many things that I've criticised the BBC for in my time, well, one of the things I shall always admire them for is the stand they made quite firmly over 1984. They said, yes, we've done it, and we're going to do it again, despite all this outcry. They believed in what they'd done, and they had the guts to repeat it.